I'm going to make an announcement in a minute or so, but as I mentioned at the end of last session, I found the discussion fascinating, and we raised many points dealing with rationality, irrationality, the question about religion vis-a-vis nationalism, questions of actors, etc. To me, one of the main questions is whether there is a problem that is driving the other problems, whether there is a hierarchy of problems, whether that if we solve a particular problems, then other problems will follow, solutions will follow through because those other problems depend on that certain problem. Now, maybe that metaphor is incorrect. I tend to think that it may have to do with identity, and certainly I would be very much like to hear some opinions from you about how to put identity and rationality together, and to construct that a point that Sari is talking in his memo, if it is at all possible to construct it, especially having heard what we heard regarding the religious, the sacred on the one hand, and the interest like the Gesellschaft side of the spectrum on the other. But this is, again, just a suggestion. Let me make an announcement. Danny Kahneman called me in the middle of the session. As you saw, I had to leave. He forgot his passport in Princeton. He's in New York. So he's now in his way, driving in his way back to Princeton to get his passport. So he will not be able to be this afternoon to give his lecture. So I asked Jon if he would switch with him, and he was gracious to accept it immediately after rationalizing it in one second. He said, "Well, no, this is a logical, this is a rational solution." And so I want to publicly thank him very much for doing that.
Well, I thank you, because it means I have a very good excuse if the lecture is not
Yeah.
Well, but I also have to say that unfortunately he will not be, he will have to leave at 3 o'clock in order to prepare, just to give the finishing touches to that lecture. And so he will, but we'll bring him up to date. That's when we are going to talk about the future. So now we go back to talk about the problems, and I would like to take some names in the list. So I have Avishai and Edna. So let's start with Avishai and Edna, and then we'll follow. Avishai, please.
I think that there are two pictures of politics, grand pictures of politics. One is the economic picture of politics, and another is the religious picture of politics. I'm not talking about discussing religion, but understanding politics in religious terms and understanding politics in economic terms. Economics is basically about bargaining and exchange, and things are substitutable. The religious picture has that there are things which are not substitutable. And that's a picture of politics which pervades lots of things which has nothing to do with religion. One of them is that in religion you give meanings to things, and the politics is about giving meaning. And identity is just another name of community trying to give meaning to their life. The issue usually is not identity, who we are, but identification with what we can identify. Now, I think that the issue here is what is a better model to understand the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian, and between Israel and the Arab countries. I think that economic model works better between Israel and the Arab countries, and the religious model works better in understanding the conflict with the Palestinians. There, I think the conflict is really about the two communities understanding themselves through the conflict. That's, I think, part of the story, and that's why the bitterness of it all. I do believe, as I think I'm very much in sympathy with what Sari described, I'll put it in my words, namely that if lots of kids will find themselves in the Palestinian community that are life in garbage, and there is no prospect of life after a solution, then it will undermine it. And this happened. And now, but I won't talk about the Palestinians, I'll talk about the Israeli society, which I think I know slightly better. The peace and the Oslo Agreement was perceived by half of the population as peace of the rich, of the Ashkenazi, the Western veterans, and its peace meant their peace, not our peace. Here there is a very good reason for this kind of thinking. Namely, I think that on Israeli society, there are lots of division in the Israeli society. But what is, I think, the emerging important division is between this part of the society which is globalized, which is part of the world economy, and the other half which is unglobalized, or unglobalizable, which includes, at the moment unglobalized, which includes many of the Eastern Jews, the Arab Israelis, the ultra-Orthodoxy. And they believe that their way, the people who are globalized feel that they can improve their life through the economy and the market. The other side believe that if at all they can improve their life through politics, because there it's not one shekel, one vote, but one man or woman is one vote. For that, in the Jewish community, there is a great deal of feeling, and that was the feeling during the Oslo Agreement, that if there were going to be peace with the Palestinian, Jewish solidarity in the Jewish community will evaporate. Will be part of the new Middle East in the Paris vision. And once they lose their strong identity, the solidarity vanishes, no one will look after them. Therefore, it's not our peace, it's the peace of the rich. And the first symbolic thing that happened after Oslo, after the peace with Jordan, was someone who was a strong supporter of this peace, removed his textile factory from a developmental town to Jordan, because it's cheaper there. So I think that the anxiety is, there is the issue of identity, which is a serious one in its own terms, but there is an instrumental identity, namely that Jewish solidarity based on strong identities is our guarantee that we'll be looked after. And the thing is, can peace undermine it? How to recruit the people who were detached and alienated from the Oslo Agreement and drag them into the process. This forces us to discuss the conflict in very different terms. The kind of talk here, which is politics in the economic mold, won't capture the imagination of those people. You can't just say it serves this interest or the other. That's not even the terms of recruiting an important segment of the Israeli population. So I believe that identity politics is part of the story. it's the main part of the story for the conflict with the Palestinians. And the issue is not just the general identity of the Israeli community, of the Jewish Israeli community, but within the Israeli Jewish community, that's very much part of the problem. So all sections and subsections of the society are ultimately engaged in this game of politics of identity, which is a pretty nasty politics. Because, as I said, it's very hard to know how to deal with it. I think that the dominance of the economic model in politics, I think, makes us ignore not being able to cope with the second picture, which is at least as relevant as the economic model for politics.
Thank you, Abhishek. Edna, I have Jon and Mike on with the two fingers, so if you don't mind. Sure. And yes.
I'll try to be quick. Avishai said if the kids find they live in garbage after the solution, there will be no solution. That may be true, but there is a precedent to the contrary, namely the South African transition. The South African transition was essentially the work of what is sometimes called the lost generation, young people in their teens, early 20s, who worked for the ANC. After the transition, they got neither land nor justice, which explains why the rates of individual violence in South Africa are among the highest in the world. There is no collective violence. There's no collective violence.
So far.
In South. Yeah, so far. And I asked President Mbeki about this on occasion, and he said, we are a patient people, but...
Yeah, my hunch is that, well...
That what? That it will
erupt?
It will erupt?
I actually just have a question for Abhishek, because I'm fascinated by this question of the religious domain on one hand and the political domain on the other, or the economic versus the religious model. And it's a very compelling way of framing sort of different kinds of logics for how we can think about the conflicts. It reminds me, though, Shilby Tilhami has argued that the conflict's becoming more intractable because it's gone from nationalization to Islamicization or fundamentalization on both sides. And I'm wondering if you have always thought this way, that the conflict can always be understood in these terms, or instead has something happened over the last several years that you think has led to a transformation in terms of the dominant logics, whether it's moved from one that could be thought of in terms of political, but now is sort of deeply religious. And if there has been that shift, can you identify what provoked that shift, or even just shift your own thinking?
I have a question, so you might as well add it on. Again, I also thought what you were saying about identities, and the clash of identities and all this, narrative and so on, in the Israeli-Palestinian case, setting it apart from Israeli-Arab, and I would agree with that broadly. But I'm trying to think through the implications, and my question is specifically whether you would feel that, how important is it in order to have what we're calling a rational solution? And given what you were saying about the complicating role of identity, how important is it for each side in a way to be convinced, to believe that the other side actually believes in one's own identity? I mean, it's one thing to say, all right, you accept our existence because otherwise you know you're going to be beaten and you've got no other choice. So it's a pragmatic decision to accept our existence and recognize it, or recognize our rights even. But we don't believe you actually believe this. How crucial is that?
One last, actually, if I could get Sari also to answer my question, because I'd be curious as to whether you think there's been that kind of transformation in the Palestinian community as well, in the way that Abishai has talked about it within the Israeli community.
a quick answer. I was actually, for a long time, I was worried of changing the nature of the conflict. So it's not, I think almost from when Sari and I used to talk about the conflict in 1968. So I think we used to see each other every day in the morning in a lousy coffee house in Pembroke Street in Oxford, talking politics, and I was always worried that this is a possibility. But I was worried in a rhetorical sense, not really. I mean, I thought it's a possibility, but I didn't believe that it will happen. Then, after Goldstein's, the dynamic changed, and I started believing that it may change into a religious war. That's a serious possibility. About how it is important to your question, I think that at the beginning there was a tendency to deny that the other side believes in what they say. And first of all, there was a belief that Israel is an artificial entity anyway, and everything about it is artificial. They may be strong technically, but it's a soulless community artificially created. And therefore, they don't really believe in anything. And with the Israelis, sure, it's the whole Palestinian is an invention, and it's not really, and there was a whole story that... I think it's all changed. Both communities now strongly believe that the others strongly believe in their identities. I don't believe that the issue of identity is that there is now this kind of not accepting that the others are believers is an issue. They are actually terrified that there are true believers, and all of them, if at all there is they tilted to the other extreme. That's my, sort of in crude terms, my understanding. So, yeah.
Actually, it's sort of, I was asking the opposite. It's not so much whether, say, Israelis believe that Palestinians exist as Palestinians or Israelis exist as Israelis. It's rather that if, for instance, part of the solution is, it's about intentions maybe, if you like, i.e. that in recognizing, for instance, if the Palestinians were to say, or Hamas were to say, we recognize Israel's right to exist, but Israelis don't believe that Hamas actually believes this.
Yes.
Is that then a peace breaker, or whatever the expression is for that?
A deal breaker.
A deal breaker. Because the reading is that Hamas may be forced to accept this and will live with it for a while as long as it has to, but there's no fundamental internalization. And therefore, let's not get into a deal in the first place because we don't trust the intention behind it. I mean, that's sort of what I was trying to get at.
That's very much there. I mean, I believe that, yes. That's it. No. Whether I believe that it's a requirement, no, I don't make, my line is don't make ideological imposition on the other side. Just, you have to solve it the minute you get trying to make ideological. I believe that the issue, the serious issue, and that's the issue of living in the garbage, I believe that the issue of irredentism will be very strong there, with a solution. And I won't trust whatever they say, and they shouldn't trust us, whatever they say. Irredentism will be part of a solution. If it can last, what the Bible says, 40 years of quiet, I'll buy it. But irredentism will be there. It will be like Northern Ireland after solving the issue of, then they will become with the Arab Israelis an issue about the Galilee, one man, one, I mean, it will start the same dynamics after the solution. The same dynamics that happen in Ireland will happen inside Israel. Irredentism will be there. And whatever the two sides say, I think it's the irredentism. I don't believe stable in the strong sense. I don't believe that it will be stable.
I would like to give Sari the possibility.
The point I thought I wanted to make before the intermission will, I think, now become a kind of footnote to what Avishai talked about. Before the intermission, Tom enlightened us a little bit about the Vietnam War, and part of the way you described it was the way Johnson saw the war as opposed to the way Ho Chi Minh saw it, right? And I think that this is really a crucial point, which is the importance of, well, the word that Joel introduced, and I hate the word narrative. Maybe I don't know if I want to use narrative, but story is a good word. The crucial importance of the story each side tells itself about what the conflict is about. And I don't think that we have arrived at a calibration of what the Israelis and the Palestinians see the conflict as being about. A calibration of the story, of the narrative, of what the conflict is about. What it is that... What was the word that was not... The calibration was the word that... Okay, they don't... They're not on the same... They're not aligned, they're not calibrated. It's not common knowledge. No. It's really a common story of how we tell. Listen, it begins with how we tell our own history and when we start the history from. What is the basic grievance that we want to address? We, as opposed to the Palestinians. So Israelis tell themselves now a story about wanting to live in peace and quiet. The Palestinians tell themselves a story about honor and humiliation and justice and of course identities enter into this. I don't think it's fundamentally about identities, but I think that the way that the question of identity enters the story we are interested in via this issue, which to me is very central. How each side frames the story and what is there to be solved. I leave it at that. Okay, thank you.
I have to make a switch. I will let Sari speak next if the others don't mind. I'll leave it at that. So Sari, please.
Well, thanks. Well, there are several things actually that I'd like to say, and that's why I wanted to answer the question, Mike's question, in the context of my intervention. The first thing is, I think that there was, and I liked what Joel said earlier, a sea change in 20 years ago, whenever it was, in 1987, 88, 89. And onwards, there was a sea change. There was, in my own sense of what was going on. And I'm not sure where we are today, whether we have continued to progress or whether we have regressed. But whatever happened in the past 4 or 5 years should not make us forget that there was a radical change that took place at some point, late 80s, early 90s, in the sense that there was clear readiness, in my own view, at least on the Palestinian side, for historic reconciliation with Israel. This is how I felt at the time. And I think I was, my sense was probably correct. So that's important. And it's important then to know what went wrong, because clearly there wasn't anything essential, to use Yazid's word earlier. There wasn't an essential problem there that was irresolvable. There was a problem that was clearly resolvable, and we were about to do that. And then something went wrong. And it's important to see what went wrong. Second thing I want to say is, again, from a positive point of view, and actually maybe it's something that makes life a little bit, our discussion perhaps, a little bit less complicated than it seems to me to be. The second thing I want to say is that, in fact, going by, I think Avishai had in his memo what he said there, all of us, everybody, not just us, everybody more or less knows what a two-state solution an acceptable two-state solution might look like. But that, and that both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, might actually go along with such a solution if there was a nudge somewhere, or if people on both sides could, the leaders or the peoples could somehow pretend to themselves, to their constituencies, to each other, that, okay, we had to go along with this. But deep down, in fact, they would go along with it because on both sides, people would think that this was a rational, common sense solution. The third thing I want to say, and here I begin to go into the negative parts of my observations. When I first mentioned the parties and who they are, and I very quickly, darkly referred to some intelligence agencies and so on, it was because, you know, and this is being said as a layman, really. It's not my field of knowledge or expertise, but that it is important to identify parties because very often one doesn't really know who's doing what. And even if you look at the Palestinian camp and look and identify individuals or groups, sometimes one doesn't really know whether those individuals or groups are in fact acting on behalf of their own ideas or some other force or some other party that's driving them to do that. And so, you know, I've come to develop some kind of skepticism concerning who specific parties represent, who they are. And what I say of the Palestinian field, I also would apply to Israel and to the Israeli field and to the United States. So I think it's very important, and I know that as academics and scholars one doesn't normally do that, but I think it's very important if one wants to really identify what's happening, what exists on the map, and what may unfold. It's important to also be clear about who the parties are, who are the instigators in the game, and are they simply the Palestinians, Fatah, Hamas, Jihad, or are there also other organizations? And what are the interests of those organizations? And are they sometimes perhaps the real spoilers for some whatever reason they might have? That's another thing I want to say. The third thing, to go back to the question of secularizing or making things sacred, I want to actually, if I may just point out, to go back, I liked the comment made yesterday by one of the students about Thucydides. And I'll bring it up again because that was a good, I mean, he made a good point. Because I think, at least, Tom had said that you know, if one knows the interests of the various parties and the preferences, then it's an easy, in economic reasoning, easy matter to try and define what a rational solution is and perhaps to reach it. But actually, we now know from the discussions that we took place now that there's some things, like Avishai was talking, there's some sort of holy things or religious things that are very difficult to come to terms with. But actually, not even religious things. I mean, take up what Yazid was saying. To go back to the millions and which is a good example I always use. These people were prepared to sacrifice their own lives for a value such as freedom when the Athenians came and tried to impose their will on them. And there's this very beautiful dialogue in Thucydides between the people who are upholding values, the millions in this case, and the people who are arguing on the basis of power. By the way, Thucydides was one of the first people to have mentioned interest as a motivating factor, but he also mentions such things as values. And this is before God came into the picture. or issues to do with God. But that's an important matter because it means basically that whether we're talking about religion or about culture or values, there are motivations there that have to be taken into account, and sometimes one cannot reach a rational solution in the context of, and that's what I was trying to refer to in my memo, on the same plane, so to speak, with this just interests being taken into account because people are in different spheres or spaces. One is operating in a space in which some values are motivating one's or beliefs, commitments, as opposed to another operating in another sphere. Now here then I say that it is important to, in trying to identify what a rational solution is, and I like to, again, to go back to refer, if I may, to yesterday's talk with the coins, that the coin doesn't remember. Maybe there is no rational solution out there. And what makes a rational solution, rational or not, are the actors, are the people. And so here the question is, well, what would make actors arrive or to try and design a rational solution? And that's why I mentioned the issue of faith, a secular faith in this case, in a better life, and to try and market this vision for a new life that might attract and therefore transform the attitudes, feelings that people might have on both sides of the divide. So just to end this particular comment, I'd say that if a way can be found to, in fact, outline, create faith. I mean, you know, thousands of years ago, we had people who walked around marketing faith in a better life afterwards, and it worked somehow. So what I'm saying here is that what we need, perhaps, are people who will walk around to market something, a life on earth, a happy life, a paradise, if you like, on earth for the two peoples. That may be one way to attract them to transform or begin to change their attitudes towards each other. Now, I want to say one last thing, and that's to do with the question, I think perhaps Mike's question, which is, I think publics are fickle. And although sea changes do take place, by its very nature to say this statement is also to say that things can go totally backwards. And you can see it. One day you can see a public that's totally in favor of one thing. I mean, we saw it in Julius Caesar, which is a good you know, Shakespeare's thing. I think it's a good political. I don't know whether people teach it for politics, but it's a good political essay, or because, you know, one minute they are in this direction, and the other they can be totally going in the opposite direction. And so, whereas today, if I walk around in the streets, I'd feel and ask people what you want, I'll probably find Palestinians mostly telling me or reacting that we don't want to recognize Israel and this and that and that. I personally believe that if a chance is presented, the chance, the hope for a new life, and it sounds credible, it seems credible, then I think people will just transform again and will go for it. And one way of doing this, by the way, to get back to a point that was mentioned earlier about believing whether the other side believes that that a solution like this is acceptable, is by building it up. And if I may say so on a personal note, I try to do this with a colleague, an Israeli colleague, where we try to build up this kind of belief that the other side is prepared to accept through actually signing, you know, with your own you know, hand, a particular document that states exactly. And the more because you see, I have my mother, whom I go by, and you know, my mother, who did not sign this document yet, but always tells me, look, if the Israelis are prepared to, you know, of course, I'm all for it, but the Israelis are not prepared to. You're deceiving yourself. So in a sense, my journey among Palestinians and Israelis is to make people like my mother believe that it is possible, and do it step by step, one person by one person. And I think you build up. Well, I mean, you know, now if I went and asked the same people, they'll tell me, you know, I don't count. But we got more than 250,000 signatures on the Palestinian side alone, which is amazing. I mean, it's unprecedented. It's never happened before. Never in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that ordinary individuals would actually sign their ordinary names to a document saying, you know, because normally you'd say, let Abu Mazen do it or Arafat do it. But why should I, the ordinary person, do it? But for them to have come forward and said, you know, I'm prepared to do this, is amazing. And we had a similar number on the Israeli side. But I think had the situation been different, we would have been able to go much further. But there are political forces that were also fighting against it. And I'm not sure they're all necessarily clear political forces, what I would call clear political forces. I'm not sure who was fighting against it.
It occurs to me that if we're going to think innovatively, we should move away from God and go back to the Greek gods, who are a lot more human, you know, and sort of conceited and lustful and bad-tempered and greedy and so on. That might help us out a little bit. I mean, I've got a few very sort of scattered little thoughts. One is incidentally on my personal transformation. For me, the event that really triggered a very fundamental shift in my thinking was the massacre at the Sabra Shatila camps in 1982, when I felt that no matter what the issues, people shouldn't be killed like that. And I didn't want Palestinians, especially the poorest, the most dispossessed, the most vulnerable, to go through that again. And for me, I was just convinced that no matter what the issues were, that there had to be a different way of solving this. And I don't know what one can conclude from that, but I was just sort of reminded of this by Mike's question. And also on the ability of people starting from a religious perspective in terms of politics and identity, there can actually be at times compromises. I mean, look at the dispute between different Christian communities in Jerusalem over, you know, the key to the Church of the Sepulchre. You know, finally they worked it out. They gave it to, was it the Nusaybi's? Or the Khalidis, or the Husseinis, or someone. Some Muslim family holds the key because none of the Christians could agree on whether the Orthodox or the Anglicans or... Maybe. Well, in the terms... We could, but in terms of the Chekhovian solution, which is, you know, better a not entirely satisfying solution than one in which all the players are dead on the stage, it's worked for a few centuries. You know, the alternative is what happened in the Bethlehem Church of Nativity, where everyone's got a roped, cordoned off little section of their own, which they jealously guard. I mean, saints' tombs, I can think of, you know, all sorts of places in the Middle East, certainly, where different types of Muslims, Christians, or Jews will actually venerate the same saints. I mean, who knows? Anyway, coming back to the broader issue of identities, though, and some of the thoughts that Avishai, some of the comments he made early on made me think, and I agree very much. Well, first of all, I think that identities can coexist. I mean, and it's identifications that are the most critical issue. I would qualify one thing, I think that's important for us, this is why I make the point, that in fact when you look at...
Could you just clarify, when you say identities can coexist,
I mean people holding different identities, say Palestinians, Israelis, certainly same persons. We all have multiple identities and they coexist, and they're sometimes even maybe contradictory.
Yeah, that's
certainly. But I meant also at the collective level.
This kind of essentialist view of identities.
Oh, certainly. Okay. No, but I don't think anyone here was proposing that, but I also think at the collective level that different communities who self-define in varying ways can coexist within a wider legal or territorial or other framework. I mean, that happens too, whether it's a shared sovereignty or different sovereignties, but I think people can coexist with different identities. But the act of identification is a politically significant issue, and the question then is what is at stake and what is being claimed or demanded. So first I want to add one thing, though, that I don't think it's a matter of, say, identity politics operate among Palestinians and Israelis, whereas economic interest operates between Israelis and Arabs. I mean, I'm sure. But particularly because if you look at the relationship of Palestinians to Israel over the past 40 years, in fact, the economic interaction is so pervasive, regardless of whether it's dominated by one side or another and there's a dependency relationship, never mind that. But compared to anything between Israel and any Arab country, there's just nothing on the same scale. And it's because it's not just an economic interaction, it's one in which the structure of the Palestinian economy, but also the fabric of Palestinian society, of labor, of business, of thinking, of business mentality, entrepreneurship, assumptions about contract, all sorts of things are actually very intermeshed between Israelis and Palestinians. And that's an interesting one, both because it suggests that actually the economic rationale is actually very present and affects, I think, the views of many Palestinians who might dislike the occupation at one level or hate Israel, and yet at the other level engage in very practical interactions. But I think that also affects identities, and we see that, as I argued in my memo, that since the Fatah launched the armed struggle 40 years ago, before the West Bank and Gaza were occupied, there has been, and as Joel was pointing out earlier, there have been huge transformations. I mean, the Palestinian national imagining, whatever the sort of historic claims are, in a pragmatic sense, even for Hamas, even for refugees in the diaspora, there has become over the past 20 or 30 years a fundamental understanding that we're talking about the West Bank and Gaza. And the territorialization of the national claim has gone from a sort of abstract or mythical historical thing to something very specific and concrete, and that is a hugely important transformation. I pick up from something Joel's written, I know, and Ian Lustig also on sort of what 67 did on the Israeli side, which was actually maybe to open up identity in the wrong way and to sort of bring in the occupied territories into the national imagining. But where I'd be concerned, however, and this is the main point I want to make really, is that it's all very well to say identities are important, we have to somehow understand them, maybe accommodate, whatever. But what I think is difficult and I'd be wary of is the idea that we can somehow promote a solution by engineering identities, manipulating them, trying to get them into line. As anyone knows, anyone in government knows, whatever type of social engineering you do through social welfare, pension schemes, redistribution, anything you do, and certainly with identity, to manipulate it, to try and get it to where you want it is basically impossible, if not possibly counterproductive. So, and after all, economic arguments we use, like give them development and they'll stop wanting a nation of their own, or economic dividends of the peace will do the following, and it never works like that. So I think, yes, this is extremely important, but what we then draw from that is we have to be really careful about. I have finally just a question, and it's something that's bothered me for a while, and it's sort of tangential maybe, but it's about identity. The terminology that seeped in towards the end of, around Camp David 2000 and onwards, the requirement that's been sort of slipped in that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. It used to be recognize Israel full stop, but it's become increasingly added that to be recognized as a Jewish state. Now, I'm curious how people see this, and whether that in a way complicates things. To my mind, I'll just give an example. There's a pragmatic problem, which is 20% of Israel's citizens aren't Jews. And if Israel is recognized specifically as a Jewish state, then who then represents the other 20%, for instance? I mean, that might be an invitation to irredentism. In any case, I'm just curious about whether people feel this is something that can be reconciled or it's potentially a problematic issue, the sort of thing that people find hard to back down on because it's about a formal acknowledgement of a principle.
Anybody else? Sorry, okay, sorry. So would you like to do it now? If it's a two, if you don't mind.
Can I? Just about identities. I mean, I think there are two approaches. One is that they're essentially what they are, and the other is that they can be constituted. by the self. I mean, they're two sort of different approaches. And in this particular instance, I think one can make use of the fact that not only one finds or can find enemies or friends in the world, but that also one can be more positive and, in fact, make friends as one can make enemies in the world. So these are the two approaches, and I think one should maybe make use of them in engineering, as you put it, and it may be useful.
There are some words that have the mysterious quality that when I hear them, my mind goes blank. Sovereignty is one such word, and identity is another. However, it's not entirely hopeless. I agree on the subjective side that identification with is one way of spelling it out in non-obscurantist terms. I would even put in a good word for essentialism. Not we as scholars. We shouldn't be essentialists, of course, but the populations out there are essentialists. They think of the others. Many of them think of the others as essentially this or essentially that. And that is, in fact, probably a very large obstacle to solutions, because psychologists have discovered essentially what you might call lack of character in people. People don't have a character. There's very little cross-situational consistency in the way people behave. However, they also discovered that nobody believes this. Everybody entertains a false belief that there's a large degree of cross-situational consistency in behavior, which is essentialism. So if one could de-essentialize the image of the other and say, not you are a bad person, but you did a bad thing. And marital therapists know this very well. That's what they tell the spouses. No, don't say he's bad. Say he did a bad thing. And so it's de-essentializing the image of the other, if that could be done. Now, what I really wanted to say was something about the objective dimension of identity, which is homogeneity. And here I think we haven't discussed so far, or only tangentially, the fact that especially the Israeli population is how many populations? 5, 6, 7?
7 million Arabs and then 6 million Jews.
Yeah, but
No,
then,
but you want how
yeah, but how many? No, I mean
What you
the
call the
Israeli,
half tribes.
you know, the
At least
there are
5.
the Russians, there are the Arabs, there are the Ashkenazis, there are the
Ultra-Orthodox.
so you know, and then I want to add, demographic trends. If differential fertility rates project a different composition into the future, how does that affect negotiations in the present? And mention this in my memo, but I would like to bring it up again.
Yes.
Look at me.
If we're talking about possibly better life, the experience in the third world over the last 20 years has shown us that there has been a extremely rapid drop in fertility rates and in natural increase rates in many, many countries. This has already, I think, begun to happen among the Palestinian population in Israel. We would imagine that some kind of stability, economic and political stability, is going to have effect there. So these projections don't tell you too much. But I just want that my main rejoinder, not rejoinder, but actually just comment was on this notion of the Jewish state, because I think it's a very interesting question, especially for someone like me who has, you know, kind of some problems with this conception of a Jewish state. I think, how do I say this? First of all, I think that the notion of the Jewish state comes out of a category that is very, very prevalent in the world today, and we don't recognize that, and we have to think about that in a broader context. So can we talk about a Turkish state when 20% are Kurds? Can we talk about a Serbian state when 20% are Croatians? And you go on and on and on and on like that, where you have states actually named after ethnic groups, but which have very large, sizable minorities who are not part of that national titling of the state. So in this sense, Israel's not such an exception. The question is, how do you normalize that view in a way that because I don't think, to me, just looking at Israel now, the question of a state for all its citizens is not on the table for the vast majority of Jews. But I was very encouraged by the Arab legislators who put forth this question and sort of said, here's what we would like, because I thought what they were doing was sort of saying, we'd like you to think through this conception. Here's a counter proposal. We understand that this counter proposal is not going to be accepted. Maybe I'm reading too much into them. The others can tell me if I am. We understand, but let's talk about what you mean by a Jewish state and what that then means for the minority. Does the minority have national rights? Does it have individual civil liberal rights that are equal? And if it has national rights, how are you going to express those in the public sphere? So it raises all kinds of questions. So I think I don't want to just sort of take what we mean by Jewish state as a kind of fixed meaning, but something that's open for negotiation that I think Palestinians in the end could accept.
There is this idea that essentialism is something which is immutable, like dogs and daffodils and diamonds, whereas the Dutch people and the Dutch language is a construct. And therefore, if it's essential, therefore it's immutable, whereas things which are constructs are changeable and can be manipulated and changed. It's easier to manipulate natural kinds like daffodils and dogs and diamonds than to change the Dutch language and the Dutch people. So the whole idea that something is construct, therefore is in transition, it's easy to manipulate. And there is this idea that if something is artificial, like the way Israel was described, as if you cannot be drowned in an artificial lake. So, I mean, I think the whole thing about essentialism and construct in terms of the political implication, what is subjected to manipulation and what is not, I think doesn't hold water. I don't think it's, I don't take it too serious. Of course, every human delineations of groups and so on, it's all constructs, but this doesn't make it easier to solve. It's a construct rather than an essential thing. Now, about the Jewish state, Herzl didn't talk about the Jewish state. He talked about the state of the Jews. And I am all for it. A Jewish state means it's an ideological state. Jewish doesn't mean that it's the state of Jews, but with a certain content. And then the issue is what exactly makes for Jewish, and then there are tremendous bids of who will fill the content of it, whether it's the ultra-Orthodox version or the Orthodox version. So I think I'm against a state ideology and founding the state on an ideological manner. Yet I'm all for the state of the Jews. I think it would be a terrible thing for the Jews, for example, and this is the crucial element, and that's actually the law of return, which accepts Jews unconditionally. I think that the Jewish history is such that to deny Jews from being accepted unconditionally is unacceptable. That was the whole point of creating a Jewish state, as an asylum. That's the way they called it. And therefore, I know that this law is under attack, and I think that I'm all for the state of the Jews. Namely, I don't see myself living in a state that will deny Jews that can be potentially endangered. And the same, I think, I expect a Palestinian state to have a law of return for the Palestinians because of the history of the Palestinian diaspora. So if you ask me what is the content of it, first of all, I say I'm against the idea of a Jewish state in the sense of filling it with content, religious, culture, whatever. But I'm for the state of the Jews, the way Herzl conceived it. Then about the demographic thing. Demography is what changed Sharon and Olmert at the end. Namely, the feeling that it's the last chance, basically, that between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan Valley will be 10 million people, half and half Palestinian, and in 25 years, 30 years, there'll be a majority of Palestinians. And that's, I think, Labor always argued. There was a nasty element to demographic talk. But at the end, I believe that this was the thing that changed most. Made the main contribution, change of heart in the right, was the realization of what they call the demography. So if you want a state of the Jews, or what they think a Jewish state, you can't have a Jewish state and this kind of demography. And Israel is caught now in this dilemma. And this dilemma is that the practical reality is as it is in the last 40 years undermines Israel as the state of the Jews, or as a Jewish state, no matter. And I think that internally, so then the idea was we'll do it unilaterally. Partly out of spite to the Palestinians, we don't have to negotiate with them, they don't count. We are their sole agents, basically. But partly because it's a long process and who knows when it will end, let's do it now. And I think this, in that sense, demography was crucial. You ask about demography, internal demography in the Israeli society and how this is, that's a different story. But if you ask me about what will make the Israelis change, I think to what they will respond more than anything else, to my mind, is at the end, nasty maybe as it is, it will be demography more than anything else.
Can I just interrupt for 1 minute? I have to leave, unfortunately, and I am so very upset that my calendar got screwed up. This is a fascinating discussion, and as someone who is well known to be vitally interested in this subject, I do hope, Emmanuel, you'll have another of these symposia, and I would like to sit in on the whole damn thing from beginning to end. Thank you all so very, very much, and good luck with the rest of the debate. It's a fascinating one, and for me to be sitting down with this group of intellectuals as some kind of good game.
80% to 20% in terms of numerical advantages. But our studies of Civil War actually shouldn't lead us to be very sanguine. So it may seem like a lot, but in fact, the percentage of Jewish Israelis has shrunk considerably, and we haven't even added the foreign workers. And that once you do that now, at least if you add those in, and there's reasons why you should or should not, the percentage of Israelis that are Jewish comes down around 71%. And most projections suggest it's going to slide a little bit even more. Well, most studies of ethnic and civil conflict tell us that once you actually cross that 20% threshold, then you begin to have troubles, especially when you add into that the fact that Israeli Arabs, as you know, no longer, or at least in totality, do not call themselves Israeli Arabs, but for a variety of reasons, political, ideological, will now call themselves oftentimes Palestinians as well. And so you do actually set up a situation of, I think, real danger. So that even if you do solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem in terms of 67, there is still this other issue, which is, of course, why there are many people, not just simply Lieberman, but even the International Crisis Group has argued that part of that territorial exchange that has to come about will mean some kind of swapping of blocks of settlements, Jewish blocks of settlements, for those Israeli Arab villages that are proximate, contiguous to any future Palestinian state. And, essentially what it means then is that, and this is actually, I think, very hard for us nice liberals in North America to get our head around, is that we are grappling towards some kind of purification, that we are grappling towards the idea of national purity. And as good liberals, we always like to believe that, in fact, we should, have a multitude of different people that can get along. But in fact, I think the underlying narrative that's taking place here is towards purification. And so, part of what I try to do in the memo was say, if we don't have that rational process to a rational solution of a two-state settlement, then what happens? And I think one of them is some kind of national purification. But I think part of it does tie very directly to these demographic issues. You can't get away from it.
One thing about the projection of demography. There are remarkable changes. The most remarkable is in Iran. Iran's birth control is a huge success, better than the Chinese without the coercion. But already we know about the Palestinians in Gaza Strip and in the West Bank and inside Israel. We know already, before the genetic drift later on, we know exactly what will happen in 25 years. What will be in 50 years, that's you may be right. So already we know the numbers, and the numbers are staggering. The Bedouin community has the highest birth rate in the world. It's 6.7. It's unprecedented in sort of in human history, this rate of, and that's only the Bedouin around Beersheba in the south. In Gaza Strip, and it's 4.5 like Saudi Arabia, and no change. In Egypt, there is a decline, actually a significant one, but not in Saudi Arabia. And Gaza Strip, there is actually 4.5, as I said. Among Palestinians inside Israel, the rate is 3.2, 3.4. It's much higher than the Israeli rate. So we actually, without really far-fetched predictions about what will happen in 50 years, what will happen in 25 years, I think we have a quite good grasp of what will happen. And in the Jewish population, you know that the ultra-Orthodox or the Orthodox community has sort of a birth rate like a sort of 4.5, very high among the ultra-Orthodox. So we know basically what the nature of the future community in 25 years will look. You may be right about long-range changes, but the situation in that immediate future, I think, is pretty pretty well understood and can be predicted with quite certain.
Let me make a point at this time. I'm hearing, I'm listening to the discussion, and I hear a lot of we know. And the question, if we know, why then are we stuck? Because you are not talking about when you say, of course, we know personally, we know around this table, but there is a perception that they know too. And when Avishai talks about the solution, and the solution is clear, it's out there, the question is, almost inevitable by why the tunnel is not there.
No, I didn't say inevitable.
Well, no, that I said, I'm sorry. But why then the tunnel? And so I ask myself, then, what is there that it's almost like we can see the solution is there, and it is in a different dimension, that is in a really different physical dimension that we cannot cross. It is like if the tunnel will be a black hole, in that sense. If I go. And I ask myself, what is then that if we know, why then are we stuck? And then I go back to the question of identity and the stories that we tell to ourselves. And we Jews tell this, or Israelis, in fact, tell the story that we tell because we were persecuted during the ages. And here I want to tie knowledge, behavior, and identity. Everything that the other side does, we analyze it in terms of persecution. The Palestinians tell a story and understand and know what they know in terms of our legitimacy or lack of legitimacy. Thus, everything that we do daily, in fact, self-fulfills and makes them feel that they are correct. And I feel that at least, I'm not saying this is the thing, but I feel that we haven't been able to get through beyond that. That is, we are caught in the vortex of that thing about knowing, seeing the solution, but not being able to get there because of where we come from and the story that we tell ourselves. We enact it every day by seeing what the other side does, and vice versa. I just thought to say that as a provocation.
So just to follow on from what Emmanuel said, to represent Danny, who's chasing his passport right now. The kind of stories that Yazid referred to, the kinds of attributions that you refer to, Yazid, where where your own story is immune to evidence about the other, where the kinds of attributions you talked about are essentially closed systems. That's in fact the norm, Tom, right? That's where you talked last night about, that's what is at the limit of rationality. That's what their research over 25 years has documented as, in fact, what we should expect. So the story that the fact that there's no tunnel is, in fact, what you would expect. That's not the surprise. The surprise is when those limits to rationality are breached. There's one example that Israelis looked at demographic data, we just talked about it, and that breached those limits. And somehow the existing narrative was breached because the data were so compelling, for whatever reasons, the nasty politics of democracy, as Avishai rightly puts it, were so compelling that the story couldn't be sustained in the absence of. So again, I come back to a variation of the question I asked this morning. The tunnel is not the surprise. The tunnel is what we would expect. Where's the agency to break through the tunnel? What do we see on the horizon, in other words, that's the functional equivalent of demography that changes, that opens the narrative even for a window? So that we break out of what is frankly the common pattern. To put this in language which I hope Tom will challenge, right? Your talk last night, Tom, was an hour. It was 1 minute about rationality and 59 minutes about the limits. All right? And I thought Tom did a brilliant job. But it's in that sense that the challenge is to me. It's how do we break through those limits? Identity stories don't break through the limits. Identity politics don't. So if you look historically at all, and what we in my field call enduring conflicts, conflicts that stretch out over 25, 50, 75, 100 years, it's the hinges that break through, either because the world around changes or there are some internal dynamics, and they're usually social, that open up those conflicts.
But then the question is of agency, as you say, and I'm going to give Sari's the floor because he's having a too, but whether that too can be engineered. When you talked about agency, it is somebody leading in some particular direction.
Absolutely.
So,
Look what I...
Okay. No, that's good. Sari, and then Jon.
Okay, I just wanted to quickly say that maybe in answer to one of the questions concerning demography, that in fact it's taken a long time in Israel for people to absorb what was happening.
Yeah.
The first time I was aware that there was a debate, in fact, was in the mid-'80s. And it was a time when Shimon Peres himself and other people in the Labour Party first mentioned. And I remember now, even 20 years later, something, in my opinion, very important he said at the time, which was that we had to make an exchange with the Palestinians because we hold the power of the present, but they hold the power of the future. And the exchange has to be between present and future. And this was the first time the conflict was phrased in terms not of the classical balance of power. Now, there are some people who picked this up in the Labour Party, but it's taken, all these 25 years for other people like Sharon to finally latch onto it. And sorry, Yazid, yes?
Mid-70s, I think, when the Koenig report came out, and that was a government-commissioned report to deal with the demographic threat in the Galilee.
Yes.
That's 30 years, over 30
It was
years.
within Israel. Okay.
Yeah, in Israel. And on the Palestinian side, Nazih Qura was writing in the 70s, this was Khalid Hassan and Nazih Qura, were talking about how ultimately Israel would be defeated through the demographic means.
Yeah. Well, I remember the 80s because I remember Peres saying it, and Gadi and other people were mentioning that at the time, which is when I called for annexation by Israel as a way to wake Israelis up to the need to go for the other option. But it's taken all this time. And the other thing which is important to this, I think, is the Palestinians, because I don't think the Palestinians woke up also to this particular element of bargaining power, not even till today. So, for example, whether in Madrid or later, they have always tended to think that it is the use of suicide bombing and killing and shedding blood that actually can drive Israel to the table. And they never really took it seriously enough that what may drive Israel to the table, talking about interests, is simply a rational forecast of how things may become in the future and what it is best, therefore, in the people's interests to try and resolve. Sorry, that's all.
Okay, I have Jon, Edna, and then Joe.
2 fingers, right?
All 2 fingers.
Well, reference to stories made me think once again of, well, as you may have guessed, I am divorced. And so I know something about the importance of the struggle over the past and the importance of the grudge book. Now, after the end of the civil war in Athens in 403 BC, there were two decisions of an amnesty and of imposed amnesia. There was a ban on references to the past. Because as long as the grudge book is there on both sides, it will be very hard to find, and it's used, it will be very hard to find a stable solution.
And amnesty and amnesia, of course, share the same root.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Edna?
Well, you said that we know so many things. One thing we don't know, and I go back to my hobby horse, we don't know what happened at Camp David. And I think if we knew, we would be able to think, is such an exercise possible? I mean, if what failed there was accidental, maybe it's worthwhile to think of a repeat under better conditions. But if it failed because it was doomed to fail, then this is not the way to go. And I, for one, don't know. I don't know how many people here think they do know. I wonder if it's worth our while to, I know that you have opinions, and Avishai has opinions. And you were there?
Yeah. Closely there.
Playing.
Right.
Closely there.
Right, and there are other people here who were close to what happened there. I don't know if other people share this feeling that it's worthwhile to spend a few minutes talking about it. Then I would welcome that. And just a tiny reference to what Yazid said before. Since when did this notion of the Palestinian recognition in a Jewish Israel rather than just in Israel creep in? I don't know to tell you when it started. I am similarly troubled. When did it start? Recent.
2000. I think it was actually written into the Clinton parameters.
Into the tablets, is it right there? I think it's unfortunate, yes. And I think that it reflects an internal Israeli problem. Israelis haven't yet explained to themselves what it means. No. That Israel is a Jewish democratic state, and they grapple with it a lot, and they have fears, partly to do with demographics, but not only. And so their own fears about the Jewish nature of their own state is something that they haven't solved within themselves, and it's something that divides the population within Israel. So even for some of the population, some segments like, the secular ones, like, and the liberals, they don't even like the notion of that this has been introduced into the parameters. Some of us would reject that.
This is the partition plan. I mean, talking about knowing.
Yes.
It is.
Recognizing Israel.
It's actually the partition plan.
As a Jewish democratic state?
No, Jewish.
As a Jewish
state is in the partition resolution.
And Arabs who have actually insist. The partition plan is the be-all, end-all of any settlement with Israel, not any data. Actually, are committed to the recognition of a Jewish state. Israel as a Jewish state. Yes.
No. There's no Israel. There's no word Israel. It's just Jewish state in the UN resolution.
No, but that's it started by recognizing Jews.
Yazid.
Yazid, I have Joel and Yazid on two fingers.
And
so, and
I just have I have two brief comments. First of all, I don't want to. This demography thing is a complicated thing, and it's. I think the perceptions of it and how it's informed Sharon, Olmert, are very, very important. And I think it's important in a kind of objective way as well. I just, again, I just want to be cautious about it. Internally in Israel, we have had the Palestinians or Arab population of Israel at 19% for a very long time, even though for an entire generation they have had a birth rate 50% higher than the Jews. Similarly, I think it's as much emigration, which is not much talked about.
About 1 million in the early 90s.
Yeah.
Palestinians.
About 1 million Russian Jews who came in from 1990 to 1994.
Right, but what about the emigration of Israeli Arabs? It's quite sizable.
Oh, Israeli Arabs, yes.
Huh? Less than the Jewish immigration, and then and within Israel also the ultra Orthodox proportion has actually crept up very, very slowly, even up until 1990, and then when they had again a 100% higher birth rate than the secular Jews, and then after 1990 it was somewhat watered down by the Russians. So anyway. All right, the other point I wanted to make is about this agency thing. And the problem with this issue, is kind of, we sort of hope that they wake up one day and they go, oh my God, we've got to, the situation is such that we have to do this. And the problem, of course, is that they have all these competing images in their head, and these competing images are images that are mostly domestic. It was true of Arafat, and it's true of Olmert, and it was true of Sharon, which makes agency very, very difficult in the sense that you have to deal with a kind of long-term, out there on the horizon, I see something very, very terrible, and in the short term, I can be out of power in 2 months. And what are you going to deal with? And and where is your agency going to come? Is it going to come as an internal domestic political actor, or is it going to come as a statesman? And this is a difficult issue. All of them.
Yes, he.
I'm trying to remember what I was going to say.
Camp David.
Yes, although I wasn't actually, I think, going to...
Well, you can still answer that
But-
one now, since you've got the...
That's not
Yeah, I'll answer something, since I've got the mic. Yes, Mike. A separate point I had in mind anyway was that part of what I've heard makes me wonder. I mean, something I certainly loathe and abhor and don't advocate, so don't get me wrong, but this whole thing of demography and of transfer, of redrawing borders to sort of transfer, if not physically move people, but at least place them in someone else's sovereign territory by redrawing the border. I mean, that often in history has been seen as a rational response to, a difficult dilemma. Not the liberal response, but the rational response. And last year I read Mark Mazauer's great book on Salonika and the population movements and transfers, 1920, 22, whatever. I mean, horrific. And on a scale more or less like 1948. And all the issues of absentee property, Muslim Ottoman property in Salonika, and how that was taken into custodianship and what happened, and all the sort of local demagogic politics among the Greeks. And it was I kept looking at this and thinking, all right, we've done it all before exactly. But that was how things were solved. I mean, it was the rational response, and Greece and Turkey, the nationalism there is much more worrying when I visit than I think between Israelis and Palestinians even. And yet, is it maybe something we should put on the agenda? I don't, I'm not advocating, but I'm just saying it's as if the logic of what we're discussing, the demographics, force us to at least have an answer showing why it's not the solution, but it might suggest itself.
Right.
In fact, it was UNHCR that engineered the great transfer between the Turks and the Greeks in 1923.
UNHCR.
UNHCR. Well, the predecessor, it was basically the League of Nations High Commissioner
Right.
for Refugees,
Oh, I didn't
Nansen.
know they had one.
Yeah, Nansen, who actually really took the lead in engineering this great transfer. And for many, I actually, it's worth putting on the table because you see this in Iraq right now, but in Bosnia, I don't usually like to quote John Mearsheimer favorably in these contexts, take this off the record, but he wrote back in 1992, 93, I forget, in terms of the Balkan War, arguing for forced partition on the grounds that if you did not handle it then and they essentially partitioned the two sides, you would end up with this kind of partition through violence and warfare. And it was,
For Iraq now.
yeah, and it was much better to do it through a kind of, however coercive, but through an institutionalized solution than it would be through violence on the ground. That's the same thing, obviously, we're having that debate, as you mentioned, on Iraq. And we can debate all we want about whether, in fact, there should be a partition of the two sides, but we all know what's taking place in the neighborhoods, which is that there has been millions of people that fleeing different neighborhoods are relocating themselves into what they see as more protective environments. So if that recent history, if you want to use that as your historical analogy, then that suggests to you that you should actually be much more imaginative about recognizing the extent to which, if there is a conflict on the horizon, that you're better off dealing with it now and using what we think as, I don't know, illiberal solutions than waiting for the violence to come and allowing the violence to actually create the settlement.
Joel has it.
I just think that 1922 is not 2007 in the sense that you had populations in Greece and Turkey that were not politically mobilized and aware the way modern citizens are, including Palestinians and Jews. And I think that when a poll shows that in al-Fahim, 95% say they do not want to be, they don't want that border changed so that they are incorporated into a Palestinian state. You can't, in this day and age, you can't start forcing those solutions on people. What you can start thinking about is how you're going to deal and how you're going to incorporate and make livable a Palestinian nation, minority nation in a dominant Jewish state.
Okay. Is there any,
We'll talk after. I mean, I wanted to address exactly.
Can you?
Yeah, but
Okay.
enough.
All right. So we are going to adjourn in a few minutes. Let me just say, we should have switched to the solution maybe sooner, but we were having and we had what I thought to be a very interesting discussion, because at least as far as I'm concerned, we have made, if it wasn't clear before, not the difficulties, but the complexities of thinking about the conflict in terms of a very simple question of whether there is a rational solution to the conflict. I think that we have managed to map to some extent, and of course, it needs not to be written, to be put in sort of maybe a hierarchy, but we did map some of the problems that are preventing us from reaching a rational solution, or whether if the rational solution is there, that does not allow the parties to go into, as I said before, into the dimension, this other dimension. So I think that this is a very important step forward, but it is only one step. That will, I think we need to proceed at more in depth and maybe cover other issues as well. What I think I also get out of this discussion is that there is a structure agency problem here, because I hear Johnny saying we need the agency, and I agree with her in sort of the responses, but the question is, I still want to understand if, and by the way, Edna, when I said we know, that was a provocation. I'm saying, because that's how, we tend to say,
There's a lot we know.
No, but I didn't mean it. Obviously, we do not know. But the question is, I think there is something structural there that we need to identify. And this, we have been trying to identify this structure that then makes room for constructing, for doing the kind of construction I think that I think that Sari is talking about, because engineering usually fails, but the question at the level of identity, but the question is, do we have another alternative now? And if we do, and I'm not saying, I'm not prejudging, let's think about. But I think we should think this for the rest of the meeting, which is more about the solutions. We will try to have lunch in about 45 minutes. So we can be back at 1:45, and we'll be able to work on the subjects of the solution. Jon unfortunately has to leave earlier, and so maybe we can go talking substance until 3:30 or 3:15, something like that, and then till 4 we'll talk about how to, if to, and how to continue with our conversation.
So let me just add.
Of course, Tom.
I think it's very interesting that for the last hour and a half, we haven't talked about the Arab-Israeli conflict at all.
That's a very interesting comment. I'm not surprised in a sense, but I think that the idea of putting it on the table is important for things that were said at the beginning, starting from you, but the kinds of things that were said about the spoilers, because we may spend 3 days talking about the core of the conflict, talking about Palestinians, Israelis, and what we talk. But still, we will have to address the questions of the outer ring. And by the way, which is something we may talk next in our next section, is that whether the solutions of the conflict are bottom-up. That is, they start by dealing with the kinds of things that we have talked in the last 3 hours, or they should go maybe because of the let's say the Saudi plan and from the top down, and thus bring the Arab-Israeli conflict into the agenda. But let's have lunch.
Let me just tell you, the lunch is just outside. It's a 2-minute walk. Nobody has to go outside at all.